welcome to the table the team, Robert Simpson, Manager of Transport and Strategy, and I think Hamish Bunn from Auckland Transport and Mark Lang from Auckland Transport, and I welcome Richard and Dean, who are also in attendance from Auckland Transport. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for your attendance here today. Barry, do you want to say something now or after I finish? Well, maybe after we've finished. Okay, so just before I hand over to Robert, I will make an apology to the public and indeed to the councillors about the rather rushed nature of proceedings here, but that has been imposed on us by the rather constrained nature of the timeline, and that is certainly noted, I think, in the commentary and the submission on the process.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make this is impossible. This is a massive amount of material with a whole lot of things that have got to be researched and looked back on, because I think there's numbers that are wrong in here, and to get this at 8:37 on the morning of a meeting like this is just hopeless.
Well, if I could just finish, Councillor Williamson, what I was saying is that is indeed the very point that we make in our submission when we talk about the process, and we make the point that Auckland Council is disappointed with the short time frame provided for consultation on the draft GPS. That has unfortunately been a feature of successive governments now, but that's the position we're in, and I certainly thank the team who have laboured to do as well as they can under those very tight circumstances. So welcome, and over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora, everyone. I understand before I start the presentation that that the correct procedure is for me to speak to the two items that have been tabled, one of which is a letter from the Chair of the Waiheke Local Board on behalf of the chairs of all the local boards. The topic for that letter is around traffic management costs, and particularly in relation to special events. We haven't had a chance to consider that in detail, but I will note that the GPS does talk, without necessarily going into any detail, on the need to reduce the costs for traffic management, and the council and our draft submission have supported the government in that particular issue. The second tabled item is the feedback received from all 21 local boards. That's a great response from local boards. Again, we've only had a chance to skim read that, and it appears on the basis of that skim read that they are very largely in favour of almost all the points many of the points that we make in the submission, particularly around the impacts of likely cuts to public transport, walking and cycling funding. So those, the views of all the local boards will be appended to our submission as a standard practice, and sent to the Ministry of Transport along with the submission as a whole. So on to the presentation itself, and I will try to fly through this as quickly as possible to leave you time for discussion and debate. First of all, how did we get where we are now? The draft GPS was released on the 4th of March, and since then we've had a number of interactions with you, including a very detailed memo that we sent out on the 11th of March summarising the submission and some potential implications for Auckland. We followed that up with a workshop last week, sent the draft submission out 2 days later on the Friday to you to receive feedback, and have received that feedback and attempted to incorporate that as best we can into the latest draft, which is before you for your consideration today. The deadline from the government for submissions is Tuesday, midday, 2nd of April. Very quick recap here. All GPSs set out the government of the day's strategic priorities for the land transport system. This GPS has 4 such priorities, with most emphasis on economic growth and productivity. You can see the 4 of them there. I won't go into them. We in the submission have supported these 4 strategic priorities. whilst also expressing concern at the omission of certain other items, which I'll get to. That support was caveated a bit in respect of safety and economic growth and productivity, which I'll get to in a moment as well. So, as I say, we sent the draft to you on Friday, received feedback from a number of councillors, which we have attempted to incorporate as best we possibly could. In the submission, you can see some of the changes there. They're highlighted in yellow on the draft that you've got for consideration today, the changes made since the version we sent to you on Friday. I mentioned the local board views that we've received. So, key themes for our submission. You can see them there. I won't go through them because we have slides on most of these coming up. What I will say is that these themes have been thoroughly worked through as far as time constraints allowed between Auckland Transport and ourselves, and there's very good alignment at the staff level and also very good alignment at the AT board level as well. And Chair Leggett is here today, and I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to you if required to elaborate on the board's views. So we've split the presentation into two sections from here on in. One is highlighting some of the strategic issues emerging from the draft GPS, and then we'll move on to some of the more detailed funding related issues. Chief amongst the strategic issues is the omission of any reference to the uniqueness of Auckland, the special needs of Auckland, and most importantly, lack of any commitment in the GPS to agreeing an integrated transport plan with the council. This is a departure from the norm for previous GPSs, dating back to 2015, where there's always been some kind of commitment from government to working with council on transport-related matters. There's no such commitment in this document. We think, as we've discussed with you previously, that the integrated transport plan is the appropriate place to address some of the issues raised in the GPS and in our submission. Likewise, we also think it's the appropriate place to agree what the key priorities are for major projects in years to come. We also raise a point in relation to the framing of economic growth and productivity in the GPS, and there are elements in that, as I say, that we support. There are also elements that we have questions about, and in particular the lack of recognition for the fact that enhancing economic growth and productivity in a built-up urban environment such as Auckland requires the use of different levers than in less urbanised areas. In particular, Auckland is obviously growing rapidly, 47,000 people, I understand, over the last 12 months. Our transport challenges are more acute, particularly in terms of congestion, but other challenges as well, transport affordability being one. Land, obviously, is limited and it's expensive. And especially in areas where the transport need is greatest. So the focus needs to be on getting more out of our existing network, and that is certainly the theme that we've heard from you over the last year or two in terms of our transport planning. What does that mean? It means that we have to emphasise more space-efficient ways for people and goods to get around. So that means an emphasis on demand management tools, such as time of use charging, of course, but also, and very importantly, mode shift. And we're concerned, and this is a theme that runs throughout the draft submission, we're concerned that parts of the GPS take a particularly prescriptive approach that will potentially constrain Auckland's ability to tailor solutions to its own needs. Freight is another key focus for the GPS. The submission expresses support for that focus and for the need to move freight more efficiently. We are concerned, however, that there's very little emphasis on moving the need to move freight to rail, and the submission expresses that. And that's particularly important for Auckland, given the decongestion benefits arising from moving freight to rail, not to mention, of course, the emissions benefits. You've heard a presentation this morning already on climate environmental issues. We share many of the concerns that you've heard this morning. There is a short statement in the front of the GPS talking about the emphasis that will be placed on the emissions trading scheme as the primary means of addressing climate concerns. You've heard some numbers around the likely impact that will have on petrol prices, that will have significant equity impacts for Aucklanders, will have significant impacts on household budgets, particularly lower income households, unless we are able to provide much better alternatives for people to get around. And the GPS doesn't necessarily support that. That is the only mention of climate or environmental issues in the GPS, and this goes against, this runs counter to existing council policy. Another key omission that we see from the GPS in terms of strategic priorities is around working with Māori. Both the government and ourselves as Auckland Council have treaty obligations in this regard. And I think it goes beyond that, of course. My personal experience working on a whole range of transport planning exercises is that when we engage properly with Māori, we end up with a richer, higher quality outcome. There's no mention of that in this GPS, and we think there should be. The GPS sets out a number of potential reforms for the transport planning, funding and governance system. These are all at quite a high level. There's not a huge amount of detail in respect of any of them. Nevertheless, at an in-principle level, we think we should be supporting these. They align very well with where Council is getting to. Just draw your attention to a couple of them, of course. Reducing the complexity of NZTA business case approval processes. Our colleagues at Auckland Transport spend a lot of money every year trying to meet the requirements of Waka Kotahi in this regard, and any efforts to reduce that administrative burden and get things going quicker, I'm sure would be welcomed by many. The GPS also proposes a review, an overhaul of the way in which we fund transport, the way in which we gather revenue, I should say, for transport in this country, including looking at time of use charging. Again, something that we would support and I think we would seek to be involved in as well. I already talked about the focus on reducing traffic management costs, which is another area that we'd welcome. Multimodal funding. So there's a clear theme throughout the GPS to move away from the increased flexibility of more recent GPSs, which have enabled multimodal projects that attempt to improve outcomes for all users on a single corridor, whether they be people in cars, people on bikes or pedestrians. There's a theme in the GPS to move away from funding those projects as a whole and to instead break them into their constituent parts, and those parts have to be funded from different activity classes. There's no detail around how this will be implemented, but it is likely to increase the administrative burden for Auckland Transport in terms of submission of applications for funding. It's also potentially likely to lead to delay with project delivery, given that there'll be different levels of constraint and different activity classes. So some parts of a project might might receive funding, other parts may not. What do? Do we wait? Do we delay the whole project? Do we deliver part of the project and then come back a year or two later? There's no clarity around any of these kind of things. And our recommendation, first of all, our plan A is to seek a return to the greater flexibility that we've seen of recent years, dating back to at least 2015. And plan B, the fallback option being that we ask Waka Kotahi NZTA to do their best to reduce the administration costs associated with this new approach. Particularly a problem for renewals, where the contractual arrangement for renewals, where really there's no particular difference between renewing the part of the road corridor dedicated to general traffic versus the part of the road corridor that's painted for buses or painted for cyclists. So there will be additional contractual complexity introduced, we think, as a result of these changes. Also, walking and cycling is particularly hit in this regard, we think. So, for example, when delivering a new project, a new road, the footpath, the funding for the footpath associated with that road would need to come from a different funding activity. Potential there for delay, potential that we may not even be able to deliver that footpath. Again, these are questions we don't have answers for at the moment, but we would be seeking clarity on them. Likewise, a number of already consented projects contain multimodal elements. If, for example, we look at the East-West Link, which is one of the government's roads of national significance, its current consenting conditions require the provision of walking and cycling infrastructure. Taken literally, under the approach set out in this GPS, funding would have to be sought from different categories to deliver that project. And in the case of the walking and cycling budget, that is likely to be under extreme pressure. And so delivering the walking and cycling elements of East-West Link would likely either make a severe dent in that activity class or simply couldn't be funded from that activity class. Right, so that's some of the more strategic issues, and now moving on to some of the more detailed funding implications. At an overall level, there's a nominal increase in funding available through the NLTF in this GPS compared to the 2021 version, 15% increase up to 20.2 billion. However, unfortunately, since 2021, there's also been a cost escalation in the order of 15 to 20% for most of the things that AT does. Which obviously eats significantly into that increase in overall funding. Of course, there are unknowns here. We don't know exactly how much of the overall national funding Auckland will receive, and that will vary across activity classes, nor do we know where the final funding availability will sit within the band for each of the activity classes. So there are a number of variables there. That said, preliminary analysis from Auckland Transport suggests there will likely to be very significant shortfalls in co-funding availability from NZTA to support the LTP program, particularly in respect of public transport services, public transport infrastructure, walking and cycling, and local road improvements. Let's move on to public transport services, which is an area of key concern for both Council and Auckland Transport. There will be very significant pressure on this activity class. The overall funding levels are reduced by 10% compared to the previous GPS, and that's despite the increase in operating costs that I mentioned earlier. AT is planning to submit a bid for a signal to Wakakatai. I understand that it will be bidding for approximately $1 billion to support existing services over the next 3 years, and additional allocation also for new services. As I say, there is uncertainty, as there always is at this stage of the process, around how much Auckland will get and how much will be available in each activity class. But let's say that if AT received 40% of national funding in this activity class, and you can see the significant shortfalls we would be facing, depending on whether the funding came in overall at the lower or upper end of the band. Addressing these kind of increases alone would solely through increases in fares would require a very significant increase, as you can see the numbers there, depending on whether the funding came in at the upper or lower end of the band. These numbers are obviously all indicative. It's too early to give any kind of certainty, but it gives you a feel for the kind of cuts that we're facing here. What this means in practice is significant cuts to existing services, inability to deliver new services. That's particularly a problem when we think about all the money that has been invested by both government and council in critical projects like the CRL and the Eastern Busway, and we may find ourselves in a position where we would find it very difficult to provide the services needed to get the most out of that investment in infrastructure. So it's absolutely critical to Auckland's transport system as a whole, not just public transport, but to the way in which Auckland is able to get around the city and their ability to do so. It's absolutely critical that this be addressed. Public transport infrastructure. There is a proposed decrease in this activity class again. Much of the funding in year one, for Auckland at least, is already spoken for in terms of CRL and Eastern Busway. And you can see some of the numbers there around our existing commitments, and depending on where the funding came in at the lower or upper end of the range, how much we would need of that in Auckland to deliver on existing commitments. The government does specify 2 public transport projects, major public transport projects for Auckland, as being a key priority for that, and I'm sure many would welcome that, including that's the Northwest RTN and Airport to Botany. However, if these projects were to be funded out of the public transport infrastructure class, it would probably consume all of it. So our recommendation through the submission is that these projects be funded from elsewhere, and that they be treated in similar fashion to the RONs, and that they are nationally significant projects. and the funding distribution between council and Auckland Transport council and the government should reflect that. Roads and maintenance, there have been significant increases here. We welcome the increase in funding for maintenance. Auckland Transport is planning a significant increase in its ability to renew the network, and this funding will help support that, although the analysis is still to be done as to what extent that is true. There's significant increases in the state highway improvements category. Nevertheless, despite that increase, the analysis would still need to be done, but it's unlikely that all 15 of the government's RONs would be able to be funded out of this activity class, despite that more than doubling in funding availability. The GPS is very explicit. This goes to the multimodal point I made before. The GPS is very explicit that walking and cycling cannot be funded out of road improvement projects, even where walking and cycling infrastructure is delivered alongside a road improvement. So, as I say, we certainly in the submission welcome the increase in maintenance funding, but there is a risk of unintended consequences, and I alluded to that earlier in the discussion on the multimodal rules. Safety, there has been a significant change of emphasis here. So the safety activity class is now to be used for policing, enforcement, education. We certainly welcome an increased emphasis on those matters. The funding for infrastructure improvements is now to come out of the road improvement categories, both state highway and local, which explains the 40% decrease in the safety activity class overall compared to the previous Road to Zero class. We are concerned, while we welcome the government's emphasis or increased focus on those matters, enforcement and education, we are concerned that this moves away from the focus on a safe system approach, which has characterised each GPS dating back to 2012. This is the approach that recognises that drivers will make mistakes, and that we should be designing our system to accommodate that in terms of our infrastructure improvements in order to mitigate those the impacts of those mistakes. There's no mention in the safety class on walking and cycling safety improvements. They're to be funded out of the walking and cycling activity class. There's also, in general terms, it takes a more prescriptive approach to what can and what can't be funded. So we welcome elements of the government's focus on safety, but we also question other parts of it. The rail network, significant changes here again. The government has restated its commitment to funding the current round of infrastructure upgrades or maintenance that KiwiRail is undertaking on the network. Obviously, we welcome that. However, from about year 3 onwards, there's a massive drop in the lower end of the funding range for rail infrastructure, and that raises all sorts of questions around our ability, or KiwiRail's ability, to fund necessary maintenance on the network here on in. The emphasis in this activity class is very much on certain parts of the country, Auckland included, but there's very little emphasis on freight, as I mentioned before. Walking and cycling, there is a nominal funding increase in this activity class, but again, this activity class has been asked to do a lot more than has previously been the case in terms of funding the maintenance for walking and cycling, and basically any investment to do with walking and cycling has to come from this class, as I mentioned before. It's likely that even if funding does come in at the top end, it will be significantly oversubscribed from existing projects around the country, which leaves very little scope for new investments. I've mentioned multimodal. So in summary, the changes flagged in the GPS will likely have a very significant impact on AT's ability to continue to deliver its active modes program. The GPS signals government's priority for delivering a number of key projects, some roads of national significance, 3 in Auckland, 4 if you include the Walkwith to Wellsford, and some major public transport projects as well, completing 2 and building 2 others. Our approach in the submission has been to avoid relitigating these projects, in line with our view that the integrated transport plan is the appropriate place where council and government can agree between them what the major projects should be. And that's it from me, Mr. Chair, and welcome any questions you have. We have a number of colleagues behind us who are in between us. We hope to be able to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thanks, Robert. And of course, this was a collaborative effort with Auckland Transport, and the submission has the support of the Auckland Transport officers and their board. Is there anything, Hamish and Mark, you'd like to add at this point, or just there to answer any questions that members might have?
No, we're just here for questions, thank you.
Okay, great. So just before I go over to questions, just a quick reminder of the process here. You know, despite the rather truncated timeline, we have made every effort to inform people along the way. We had the memo in March. There was a workshop last week that covered the GPS, and on Friday the draft submission was sent out, and councillors and whole quarter members were invited to give feedback, which a number of people did. Thank you, and that feedback has been incorporated in this submission. So despite the pressure of time, we certainly have endeavoured to enable people to feedback into that process along the way up to date and informing the submission that's before us here today. So having said that, if there are questions that people have got on the presentation, which was received at the workshop, of course we'll welcome them now. Councillor Walker.
Sure. Given that this GPS is 10 years, and given that we know that there's a significant increase in rail operational costs when the CRL kicks in, are you factoring that into your submission, and are we covering off the numbers around that?
It's a great question. So again, while they've referenced 10 years, this is still only allocating money for the next 3, which is one of those key issues with the central government funding model. We have factored into, and sorry, maybe I'll frame it a different way. We've obviously created an LTP that's out for consultation. The numbers we're looking at in relation to this line up with the LTP, the first 3 years of it, and we're then stress testing those numbers and the assumed co-funding against what's potentially sitting in the GPS. And what this is clearly showing up is that in the first 3 years, there's a massive risk around the funding of public transport, just to keep what we've currently got on the road, before you start funding Eastern Busway and CRL services. So you can think of it in other ways. We don't think there's enough money in there to match what council set aside in the LTP.
Coming back to my question, have we got anything in our submission around the impact of the increased funding associated with the CRL? That's in this submission, because this is a 10-year statement. And quite
yes.
obviously, you know, we know it kicks in. When does the operational cost of the CRL kick in?
In year 3, essentially, in these numbers.
Is within the next 3 years, and certainly within the next 10.
Yes, so to answer the question directly, yes, we do capture that. We are saying that services, we're facing the increased costs associated with CRL in particular, and that depending on where the funding lands in the band, there will be risks to the increased services we're planning for City Rail Link.
So, to further question, do we break out the costs of the additional funding for the CRL? I haven't read through everything in detail, but do we break it out so it's highlighted?
No, we don't. We wouldn't see that as being necessary as part of this. We've signalled what we need, and it's in that figure there. Over the next 3 years, the AT requires NZTA for PT services. 985 million, that's what our request is to maintain existing services. And that is broken down at paragraph 137 in the submission. But we haven't gone further into that. NZTA are aware of the details. We don't think it's necessary.
Councillor Fletcher?
Through you, Mr Chair, I think it is, and I'll certainly raise that when I speak to this later.
Councillor Fletcher?
Thank you. Robert, can you remind us, please, where this fits within the legislation generally around transport?
Yes, so the government is obliged to produce a GPS every 3 years, and under the clauses in the Land Transport Management Act, local authorities, and in our case Auckland Transport, are required to give are required for their RLTPs to be consistent with the GPS.
Thank you for that. And I don't intend this to sound in any way patsy, but how difficult has it been to pull together such a comprehensive response within the time frame?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Fletcher. It has been very challenging. It has involved a great many late nights and early mornings, up to and well beyond midnight, for a number of people in our team and from Auckland Transport. But I will say that people have stepped up to the task, and that there's been excellent collaboration with staff at AT, who have provided us with all the details that we needed to fill out the submission.
So to that end, given that this is being presented to us as a package, how difficult would it be if people start picking it apart now and treating it like a smorgasbord?
It would certainly create a whole new set of challenges. There are themes to the submission, and if we start picking apart elements of it, then that may undermine some of those themes, particularly around, as we say, the need for a focus on Auckland and some of the other strategic issues we've got in there, climate and so on. So yes, it would provide a whole new set of challenges, and there's very little time to make those changes. That said, of course, members are, if members instruct us to make changes, that is absolutely what we'll do.
Thank you. And given the focus and the weighting that we've put on the integrated transport plan and the Auckland, the lack of focus on Auckland, my understanding is that the ITP will come to the next Transport and Infrastructure Committee. Can you confirm that you're working towards that, and that members will have the opportunity on the 4th of April to start giving deeper consideration into the integrated transport plan?
That is correct. I just will clarify that a little bit, though. It's not the integrated transport plan itself that we're bringing next week. It's the preliminary work that this committee authorised us to do around us as a council developing a position in advance of our discussions with government on agreeing the ITP. So yes, we will have an update for you in April, and an additional update in May as well.
I think that's really important, Chair, because it helps us with consistency and alignment as we work our way progressively through this, and I want to thank you for the work.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. We have Councillors Darby, Baker and Henderson.
Thanks to you all, and I also note the concerted effort that's been put into this, and there are no divergent views between Auckland Transport and Auckland Council. Most interesting. Can I just look at the safety first? Auckland Transport uses a figure of deaths and serious injuries avoided due to the implementation of aspects of the safety program, and some of those include mid-block crossings and other things that have been implemented over recent years, and this was a plan to continue with that. And it was going to save some 13.35 deaths and serious injuries per annum. Now, there's a significant backpedaling on the safety program here. So can we assume that the deaths and serious injuries at 13 a year, at least, because it's more than just the raised platforms program, that deaths and serious injuries avoided number will not be reached? So in effect, more Aucklanders are likely to die and be seriously injured under what is proposed in this GPS.
So I won't speak to the specific targets Auckland Transport may wish to. However, with a move away from a safe system approach, a whole of system type approach, and if as a consequence of that, investment in safety infrastructure is reduced, then it will have negative effects on Aucklanders, and that's likely to show up in DSI statistics.
It's always hard for an officer to say more people will be killed. As a politician, I don't want people to be killed or seriously injured. But the bottom line is, in the direction currently being travelled, more people will be killed and seriously injured. Can you say that?
Well, I mean, there is uncertainty, as I say, around the amount of funding available. Just because the funding has been moved to a different activity class doesn't necessarily mean it won't be available. That said, there are quite directive points in the GPS around what the funding can and can't be used for. Again, if there's a reduction in some of the types of infrastructure that we've provided in the past, then yeah, that may well have an impact on the number of people who die and seriously injured.
Mark, can I go to the PT, the impact on PT infrastructure and services, particularly the services? In the slide and in the submission, we identify a 22% increase in public transport fares would be required if we managed to get the number at the top of the envelope, and then 136% increase in fares if we only got the number at the bottom. What's more realistic is probably something in the middle. It's, from my understanding and the pressure on the whole funding envelope, it is very unlikely that we'll ever see anything at the top. So what is the fare increase if we were to be successful under the current numbers, if we were to take 40% of the middle in that band for PT services? I'm looking at maybe a more realistic number, a percentage increase in fares.
I don't have a specific answer, and clearly it would sit in between, but I guess obviously the key thing I'd call out is fare increases. If you start going above 30-40%, that doesn't take into account elasticity and customer behaviour. If you put through a 100% fare increase, the number of people travelling will drop, and so it will actually exacerbate the issue. So I guess what I would say is AT is committed to looking at, and we understand the intent in there is, can talk about a 40% fare box recovery. We'll undertake a piece of work to go back to saying, well, if we were to try and target 40% fare box, what would need to be true? On the face of it at the moment, fare box recovery is about, when you ignore commercial services and things and discounts come off, it's about 30%. You might need to put through about a 33% fare increase to get to a 40% fare box as of today. I'm not suggesting that's something we want to do, but we're going to do a detailed piece of work. But that by no means actually plugs all of the gap. So you could be staring at, even at the middle of the activity class bands, at a scenario where you have to put through a significant fare increase and cut services. And I know, and sorry if that sounds stark, we've had feedback from Waka Kotahi on their, this packet of the submission, and their view was they thought it was really professional. They were just wondering if we'd elevated some of these issues even highly enough. It is, if you said what's the one thing that concerns me the most in here, is our ability to keep running, buses on 1 July.
Okay, and one last one. On the revenue system reform, is it premature in a submission on the GPS to be discussing a greater sort of equity in terms of paying for road maintenance being sort of with the freight industry, which creates incredible damage to the network? Is that going to come in the follow-up body of work, as opposed to getting into the detail of that right now?
Yeah, so as you say, we haven't gone into that level of detail, but there will certainly be opportunities to do so as part of the following up work over in the years to come, months and years to come. Yeah.
Councillor Baker?
Thanks, Chair. So just, 20.2, I think, billion is the amount that the funding. How much of that is there a debt repayment requirement out of that? So what's the net amount if there is a debt repayment?
I understand it's about 2 billion, so 18 is actually what's available. And again, it's a good question. Our understanding is that it's very, very unlikely that funding will be near the top of the activity class band. So it's going to put the Waka Kotahi into a very difficult position. So it's not a fully funded GPS, put it that way.
Thanks. In terms of the national ticketing solution, that sits within the public transport activity class. So that has a huge bearing on uplifting, I guess, public transport usage, making it a hell of a lot easier for everyone. Is that within that? And so that, just clarify for me that means that if we committed, it becomes one of the priorities that we have to choose. It sits alongside our PT services. It sits alongside everything. Is that right?
That's correct in terms of what's commercially committed. And again, in that activity class, there's a significant draw on it with Eastern Busway being in flight, the new trains for CRL, the stabling, national ticketing, etc. It leaves very little money in the next 3 years for much else, to be honest. And again, if I give you a practical example, I know for the Mayor, the idea of, like making far better use of our existing network, dynamic lanes, intelligent transport system, etc., those sorts of things are, the potential funding, and therefore some of those is looking quite limited.
And just last one, Chair. So in terms of the rail network, are there any risks to us with I guess you talked about the reduction in year 3, are there any risks to us like KiwiRail deciding that they're just going to lump up the track user charges that we have to pay them? Is that a potential risk as they see a drop off in their funding?
Yeah, I believe it would be, yes, because the GPS is quite explicit around, aside from track user charges,
we need next year from Kotahi 300 million for public transport. The bottom end of the band is 400 million nationally. So we need 75% of the national pot. By the time you get to year 3, when you've got more of these services running, we need 83% of the bottom of the band. And that's why, we've got to lobby really hard that this area does get prioritised and they can try and allocate money as high in the band as possible and then our share of it nationally. But it's that's why it's so stark. But if you start reverse engineering numbers, you get scenarios where you could have to, in theory, take half of our services off the road. So, I mean, we hope we don't end up there, and that's why this submission is so important as part of providing feedback on the draft.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair and staff for allowing Julie and Councillor Ferry and I's request to have this out in public. I think that's important, but also having that submission on Friday night so we could go through it and give feedback was really helpful over the weekend, so thank you. The questions I have, similar to Councillor Henderson, on when would the changes kick in if the GPS stays the same, and when would we have to put up public transport fares, considering on May the 1st we're already doubling under 25s and bringing back charges for kids. What is the impact looking like in July, August?
It is effectively, money gets allocated as a 3-year pot. So we should know from Kotahi in late May how much funding is available for what they call the continuous program, which is, think of that as existing PT services. That will give us time to then consider what we might do. And the point is that money change kicks in from 1 July, so the longer we leave it, it mounts up over the 3-year period. But we should have some certainty in May around the continuous program funding, i.e. existing services.
Okay, thank you. The Eastern Bus, we're adding services all the time when we reach capacity or try and get ahead of it. But with the City Rail Link and the Eastern Busway coming on in this period, there is, what I can see, there would be no money for the services that we would expect from opening those projects. Is that right? There'd be little to no money for what I'm assuming there'd be a big rush to those services, and it doesn't look like the investment would make sense.
Well, there's choices between whether you take other services off the road or ferries or buses to fund CRL services, it's those kind of choices. Okay. I don't know if it's quite that binary.
If we are to, I know that 136% increase is quite an extreme number, obviously lower band if we get 40% of the national fund, but even if it's at the 20s and 30% increases, what have you had a chance to model, probably not, the impact? So the majority of people coming into the city in the mornings are walking, cycling and public transport. What would the congestion look like if, as your modelling shows, 600,000 trips potentially return back to car? What does that do to freight, to people, to congestion?
We haven't done the detailed modelling yet, but obviously in parallel we have a piece of fare work underway. What we've seen in the past is fares are pretty inelastic up to a certain point, but I guess my underlying concern is at what point would people stop travelling? If you think of a trip from CBD to South Auckland at peak on trains currently $7, at what point does that become unaffordable? Is it $10? Is it $15? It's that type of thing when suddenly either people stop travelling or they revert to cars, and what's the tipping point?
And thank you, Chair. The extra work that you'll have to be doing to go to different pots on one project, such as Lake Road, Glenvar, things like that, would that also be the same for, say, rehabs? There's been rehabs happen in the North Shore Ward at the moment. Would you be having to go to a different fund to fund the upgrade of the road and the footpath at the same time, or would it still be one project? Would that, I know for new projects it sounds like several buckets, but would that be renewals as well? Because that seems, the biggest request I get is fixing footpaths, and we can never have enough money already.
It details to work through practically, but what in reality happens is we award a piece of work to a contractor, and then we have to do the scurry around behind the scenes and try and secure funding out of different pots. It just adds a lot more complexity into the system at a time that there's desire there to simplify business casing processes. and it's an important point. The GPS sets aside money. There's still a whole process to get through to actually access the money and approval processes, and it does make it more complex.
Last question, Chair, sorry. So the essentially almost no mention of climate change carbon emissions at all, considering the TERP and Te Tarakia Tawhiri are aligned to the Paris Agreement signed up by the government in 2016-17, where does that leave us as a city on carbon emissions, if you've modelled that? And I guess, could we just check if we've done the modelling of what Paul Winton said, that leaning into the ETS would mean sort of a $1 increase to a litre of petrol if we only lean into the ETS without any other intervention?
No, we haven't had the opportunity to do that modelling, and part of that, of course, is that there's very little detail on what the government means when it says it's going to rely primarily on the ETS. In terms of Auckland's ability to meet its strategic priorities in this regard, then obviously if funding is constrained in certain activity classes, then that makes it that much harder for us to do. Of course, there are still plenty of things we can do, but it won't help.
Member Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, pretty quickly. I just want to read this first before I ask the first one, just around Māori outcomes. We recommend that GPS specifically reference the need for engagement with Māori across the transport sector, in line with legislative obligations to Te Reti of Waitangi under the Local Government Act. And then after that, we recommend that the GPS include a focus on enhancing Māori outcomes and improving transport equity. So basically, we're really simply asking the government to please do their job when it comes to Māori. We're not raising the bar here, we're not really challenging the status quo. If we're going to start with an empty cup, please just live up to your legislative obligations and hope we can elevate this position, when we should be starting with giving effect to the treaty and go from there. Start with a sort of full cup and work towards alignment. Any reference to Māori outcomes or engagement should have at its heart the requirement to give effect to the principles of the treaty, which is like a catch-all for the way government should engage, consult and promote their relationship with Māori. And as mentioned, Māori can elevate these kaupapa. We're not one-dimensional and we're not simply here to be engaged. As mentioned today also, and put so eloquently, paraphrasing, engaging in a meaningful way with Māori
always have, and it's really not, there's no easy fix. It's not too easy to say. So enjoyment.
Okay, so I've just been informed that the same technology problem we've had and unfortunate adjournment might not be able to help it in this circumstance.
They can hear now.
They can hear now. Okay, all right, so it's really back on. Okay, Councillor Williamson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. I want to just stick with public transport services. I have huge problems with this submission across the entire thing and background data and so on, but I'm going to just try and narrow it down to this one screen that's up there. And in the attachment B, sections 136 to 138, and then I want to talk about 139 to 141, which is to do with rail. The first question I want to ask you is, are you aware that the contribution that public transport users contribute towards the cost has dramatically collapsed since 2016? Because in the GPS figure 3 that's published, the passenger was contributing around about 40% of the cost of running the public transport operation. It's now down to under 10. So the first question is, are you aware there's been a massive drop in the amount that the actual passenger pays towards the cost?
Absolutely, and obviously what's happened in between times is you had COVID, which made farebox drop down below 10% for a period of time. And then as we've come out the other side of it, the half-price fares have basically suppressed half of the farebox. The under 25 discounts that are about to roll off are also suppressing it by about another 5%. But on our clean farebox, when that drops off in about a month's time, will actually go back to just over 30% when you exclude commercial services. So the numbers in the GPS, and that's what we've just described as aligning to how Whakakotahi calculated, they're actually a bit out of date. They're working off older data that was still had that hangover of the half-price fares, from what I can see. Having said that, we know that farebox, ideally, globally, you'd want it back up around 40%, and that's what I was referencing before, is if you said ours at the moment is in that bit over 30%, we're going to be just over 30% because of the distortion of these discounts. There is scope to look at increasing it, and we are absolutely doing a piece of work on that as we speak. The other thing, though, to just flag, the reason why it's now more around the 30%, as well as if you think back to customer behavioural change post-COVID, you're effectively running a service that used to have 5 days of patronage during the week, that Monday and Fridays now has significantly less, so your economics have changed. So to get back to a 40% type fare box, you've actually got to be doing a whole pile of different things differently as well, in terms of customer usage patterns, but on average actually charging more than you previously did, because you don't have people travelling 5 days a week.
Okay, well,
sorry.
You see, I find some real problematic parts of that answer. You talked about COVID being the big sort of driver there, except in 2016 up until 2020, COVID only struck in 2020. It struck at the end of 2019, but we didn't even have it here until 2020. It would drop from 41% was what the consumer was paying, down to well under 20%, so it more than halved before COVID came along.
If I could just address that. The material that's included in the GPS contains both operating and capital costs. So it's reflecting the cost we pay for PT services, plus what we invest in infrastructure to improve the PT network. Now, of course, you know, there's a lag. You start spending money to build a project, and you don't see the response in terms of patronage or fare recovery for some time after that. So it's difficult to tell from those numbers, you know, how much of that increase is due to the lag in infrastructure investment, and what we're expecting to see, particularly in terms of at least the operating costs going forward, is that we do get a recovery in patronage as the likes of City Rail Link, Eastern Busway and such come on board, and the fare recovery ratio for services certainly increases. So they're including infrastructure costs in there. So yes, as you invest more in infrastructure from 2016, you will see that number decline, but it will take time to get the benefits in terms of patronage, bringing the passenger contribution back up.
Okay, so let's now go to that paragraph 138, and where you talk about the 22 up to 136% required to have massive fare increases. I don't know how you can do that. Let me explain. If I look at the upper and lower of the public transport services in the GPS, the lower is 400 and then going up 20 million a year, 420, 440, 460. The upper is 750 and going up 20 million a year, 750, 770, 70, 90. The current amount, I understand, for that activity class is 500 million. We don't have it in here, but I've checked and that's what it looks to be, is the current amount. So how can a lower of 400 but an upper of 750 result in massive increases in fare increase, regardless of which one of those we choose? I would have loved some more background about what is currently being spent, because that's not here.
I haven't got the actual in-year numbers in front of me, but if we come back to the simple maths, so based on the draft LTP, we require in circa round numbers 300 million of co-funding from Waka Kotahi next financial year. The bottom end of the activity class range is 400 mil, and that's nationally. If we got 40% of the 400 mil, we have about a $142 million shortfall in government funding. And sorry, the bit we didn't explain is that on a matched basis, if that GPS money falls away, we've assumed that council's contribution would also fall away because it's on a 50-50 cost share basis. So you actually end up losing a substantial portion of your cost, your funding for public transport, and that when you mathematically solve it, gives you about 130% required increase in fares to plug the gap. And what that does flag is it would, if government don't fund their fair share, there's an interesting choice then for council about whether it wants to tip in more as is set aside in the LTP or scale it back.
Okay, well, I just, when you present something like this, I would suggest that what makes it really valuable is we see what the actuals are right now and a comparator. Because if, as it says in the GPS, that there's going to be a 400 to 750, and currently it's 500, then there's a potential for there to be more money in this activity class.
Sorry, I'll just point one other thing out too, is this issue is not unique. The same issue occurred last year, and what isn't well known is that the government in the May budget last year. So I know in May budget last year, previous government had to tip $80 million in to keep PT running, and they did it as a one-off top-up. So the problem was already there.
Okay, and with regards to rail, my second part was to be about rail. Is it true that we still owe quite a sum of money to Kiwi Rail for track management or track maintenance?
So at the moment, we pay Kiwi Rail a track access charge. We've paid an amount for a number of years, and that number, as set aside in the draft LTP coming forward, is in the sort of 40-50 million type range per annum. Kiwi Rail have recently come and asked us for over 100 million for maintenance, catch-up maintenance and ongoing maintenance as they fix the tracks. That number is not budgeted anywhere in either the LTP or in the GPS.
So can I just get some clarity about this? First of all, I'm asking about the past. Is there a number of years going back for which we haven't paid the bill?
No, we've always paid a track access charge, and
there's no money owing from the past.
Okay, so no, there's not, but there's always been a negotiation around how much we pay. It was typically less than what Kiwi Rail asked for, but we weren't always sure it was actually getting spent on maintenance. And so that track maintenance charge rolling forward, there's a big delta between what we have budgeted and what Kiwi Rail are now asking for more recently. So you could frame it a different way. There is a significant issue around the ongoing cost of maintaining the tracks, let alone the retrospective catch-up that's occurring at the moment. And the broader question is who should be paying it. The implication is if the tracks don't get properly maintained and funded going forward from a renewal basis, that it might need, Kiwi Rail's within their right to actually ask for tracks to be slowed or train services to be slowed down or reduced.
How does that dilemma get resolved? If they believe we should be paying X and we think it should only be half X?
Is there a
disputes resolution clause?
I don't know the specifics of how the commercial piece, I'm not that close to it, but what we have done is there are specific paragraphs flagged in here. I think it's paragraph 140 calls out the exact issue.
Yeah, I've read that. Okay, I just think this is a ridiculous process of this much detail in this sort of short time and when we get the material this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so that wraps up the questions. The Mayor just wanted to ask a final one, but he's disappeared. Duncan, has the issue that Councillor Henderson been brought up dealt with? We're just trying to see if people can still hear us online. Have you got a question to ask, Councillor Bartley? Yeah, okay, so we'll go to Councillor Bartley and then finish off with the Mayor, if that's okay. We've had a good crack at questions here today. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report and for your work on this. Since this GPS seems to be the focus is on the economy, and Auckland is the powerhouse for the country, have we got enough there to make an argument of the economic effect? Should the government not go ahead and fund Auckland adequately through this GPS?
Certainly in terms of specifics, no, in the sense that we haven't, there's not enough detail on the GPS to be able to undertake any kind of modelling or anything like that of the economic impact. But it probably gets back to the point I was trying to make at the start, which is around if the goal is enhancing productivity and economic growth, then the types of things that you would do in Auckland differ than the types of things that you might do in terms of your transport network to less urbanised parts of the country. And it boils down to the need to get more out of what we've already got in Auckland. And that has implications for the types of activities that we would look to fund. And those types of activities are, as a general rule, de-emphasised in this GPS. Michael's got something to add.
I might add to that briefly. Just as an example to make Rob's point, if you look at the roads of national significance that are proposed, including Warkworth to Wellsford, you're looking at an additional about 70 kilometres of road length for Auckland. Now, Auckland already has over 8,000 kilometres of road. So the whole RONS program is an additional 1% on our road length. And yet, in the time it'll take to deliver that, Auckland's population is likely to grow by about 20%. So if that's our primary impact on the transport system, then our economy will be going worse and congestion will be getting worse. The answer for Auckland is really about making our existing system more efficient because we cannot build it quick enough. And that's where the importance of projects like time of use charging and of mode shift, as has been discussed, is critical. Cars are fantastic. They will shoulder the burden of transport for Auckland for a long time still, but they take up a lot of space. We need to move more people onto public transport and onto walking and cycling if we're going to improve our economy.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Bartley. Having said we're just down to the Mayor, we've received 2 late entries into the field, so we need to have a stop to try and address this sound problem before we go into the debate. So I hope this is the end of the question so we can do that. So we've got, you still want to go last, Mr. Mayor?
I was just going to put an ad up, but it can wait for a while.
Okay, so if we could make these the last two, Councillor Lee and Councillor Newman, please.
Mine is a comment relating to Councillor Williamson's input, so I'll defer it until later, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Newman.
Mine was relatively technical, but the response that I've just heard really spikes my interest now. So can I just ask, because I'm reading the Auckland Transport Board minute from March 2016, which was Auckland Transport Board's acceptance of the recommendations for the notices of requirement for one of the RONs, Redoubt Road, Mill Road Corridor Project, NOR subject to conditions, which Auckland Transport's Board accepted. And it provides commentary as to why it accepted it. Safety, economic efficiency, future-proofing for growth, which has massively occurred. I'm looking at the submission. The submission reflects a fairly agnostic approach to the RONs, and says that we'll defer to the ITP. I'm trying to work out if the ITP is going to include the RONs or not. But what I've just heard appears to signal that the Auckland Transport officers are very sceptical now about the RONs for which the NORs have been agreed. So can I just get an understanding if the Auckland Transport advice today is different from the advice that was accepted by the Auckland Transport Board at the time that the NOR for Mill Road was accepted for stage 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think the comment that was just made was more relating to. Well, you want to jump in, Dan?
Oh no, you keep going.
Was more relating to the Northern State Highway 1. So that's not an Auckland Transport project. And we have had a change in policy objectives, particularly from the council side, since that point. But I think what we're trying to say with this submission is that we do want to look at all these larger projects that are captured within the GPS as high priorities to identify, you know, excuse me, collectively which of these are the priorities for investment to go next, given that funding from both sides is reasonably constrained.
Do you want to add anything to that, Dean, or is that fine?
Look, I'll leave it at that, except to say that I wasn't aware of that minute. I've not gone back to 2016, in fairness, Councillor. Our expectation as both an executive and no doubt the board, speaking on their behalf, is that as these new RONs projects are defined, that they'll go through the same rigour with a BCR and a case for them. And that'll be represented, but there's a lot of competition in this current GPS for limited capital, and the government's made those a priority. We'll have a look at them on their merits when we get closer to it.
Mr. Chair, respectfully, my question was quite specific. If Auckland Transport stands by its recommendations through an evidential NOR process for the RONs, because it wasn't just about the northern RONs, it was a broader statement than that, and it goes to where, yes, I accept that there might have been some policy changes around here, but there has been a change of government. And so what I would like to know is, does the evidential process that led to the NOR that Auckland Transport accepted, does that stand, or are you walking that back?
I'm sure that at the point in time that was done, it stood, but we don't know what the current RON's definition is, so I couldn't comment on how it stands now, Councillor. And that's all I'm saying, is that it should be looked at on its merits when we get it. Hasn't been got yet, and no, I haven't had a chance to have a look at that, nor as a board, but except that the government has priorities around the RONs program.
Okay, so thanks everyone. We're going to have a quick break, just a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes now, to try and deal with this issue with technology at the back. And when we come back, we're into the item itself and debate. Hopefully we've canvassed a lot of the items there. So just a quick adjournment, and we'll be back at 20 to 12, thank you.